Hello, everyone. Welcome to Project Generation. I'm here with probably one of the most famous faces in the shul. The official title is Elder. I don't know if in 2020 we should update that, maybe call it Experienced. I don't know if Elder is the best thing, but nevertheless, Seymour, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to explain where your Stanmore journey started, really?
Our Stanmore journey started when 5 years after we got married, Shirley and I. We were actually in Mill Hill till then. We moved to a house in Edgware, but very close to Stanmore. We had some friends in Stanmore, and so we transferred our membership from Mill Hill to Stanmore. That would have been in 1969.
Wow, just a few years before I was born then. Okay. And what was the community like then?
It was very thriving community. There was quite a lot of activity, but the sort of format of community today, it wasn't like that at all. It was a shul-going community. There was a ladies' guild, and we celebrated the festivals. But there weren't all those community programs. Of course, there was a thriving Hebrew classes, a cheder, with probably 400 or 500 children.
Oh, wow.
And Stanmore was one of the first synagogues where women were invited to be members in their own right. And that was happening when we joined.
Wow. That was a day, I don't know if today's generation can even understand that. I don't mean why women were allowed to. I mean the other way around. The other way around.
Well, I think it was an attraction to the financial representative to bring in more income. It was one of those schemes, to be fair. But it was interesting. So we had male and female members of the shul. At that stage, women still couldn't participate in any of the management of the shul other than through the ladies' guild.
I understand. And we've heard a lot about that ladies' guild actually over the course of some of these interviews.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So go on. So, and then in terms of your personal journey within the shul echelon, so to speak. So how did you get involved?
Well, my personal journey was that I was spotted by Elkan Levy, that I'd been involved in Jewish education previously. So I was sort of invited to join the board of education of the shul, and eventually I became the chairman of the education committee. That put me on the board of management, and subsequently I became a warden in the shul before I went off to the wider world, where I became the chairman of the London Board of Jewish Religious Education and left the local work to my colleague Michael Neville, who had been my co-warden, and he was joined by Maurice Hackenbroch, and I went off into the bigger, wider community of the London Board of Jewish Religious Education, at that time running all the Chadorim for the United Synagogue and 3 of the day schools, including JFS.
Wow, goodness me. I mean, that's incredible. And that was obviously alongside your normal job.
Oh, yes, I was a practicing accountant, but joined the board of what is known as, most people know as Texas Home Care. The company was actually Home Charm Group. I was a main board finance director, and I did manage, because of my seniority at Home Charm, to have time for my wider communal work.
Gosh, wow. Okay, well done, Shirley, as well. Wow. Okay, and then what were your standout moments then? Both.
Well, my standout moments in education were that we began the professionalization of the part-time system. There had never been training programs for part-time teachers, so we began those. We began weekends away, where families went away to learn, have a Jewish Shabbos experience. This was all, in those days, novel. Today, it doesn't seem novel. And of course, I became the chairman of governors at JFS. And my highlight of that experience was appointing Joe Wagerman as the first Jewish lady head of an Orthodox Jewish school. There was a lot of controversy at the time, but we managed to win through because Jo was the best candidate, and my decision was based on not whether she was male or female, was she the best for the position? And it turned out to be a very good choice. Jo went on to better things as well. She even became the first woman president of the Board of Deputies.
Wow, there you are. Okay.
So, yeah. So they were my experiences in education. But our success was our downfall because the United Synagogue were getting very jealous that we were doing so well in Jewish education, but they were actually funding through membership subscriptions the educational part of the work. And so they wanted to bring it into the United Synagogue, and that's what happened. Eventually, the leadership of the United Synagogue prevailed upon us to wind down the London board, and it became the Board of Education of the United Synagogue. That was when I stood down from Jewish education, at that moment of transfer from an independent London board to the United Synagogue Board.
Understood. Okay, and then from there, where did it lead?
Well, what it led to was a typical Seymour, where I went to council meetings of the United Synagogue and raised questions that the leadership of the United Synagogue were very embarrassed about, mainly to do with spending money that they didn't have. The causes were all excellent. There's nothing my predecessors at the United Synagogue did that wasn't for good reason. They somehow forgot that you have to pay for what you do. And so as an accountant by profession, but it wasn't only because of that, I became extremely critical of the leadership of the United Synagogue. And as a result of that, I stood for president in I'm trying to think now, very fast on my feet. I stood for president, I think it was 1990, and was defeated by Sidney Frosh, who was the then president, by a handful of votes. Wow. Lots of people felt that my cause was good, but they still had a tremendous loyalty to Sidney and his friends who had been running the United Synagogue.
Right. You could have asked for a recount in Florida.
In Florida, yes, but I immediately accepted the result and thought that time now would be that I could relax with my family. But the United Synagogue got further into debt. Sidney Frosh invited Stanley Calmes to produce the Calmes report, which is a very important document in the history of the United Synagogue. Stanley asked me to be involved with the educational part of that report. In fact, it's quite interesting because although I've been complaining about the recklessness of the finances of the United Synagogue, I actually in the report concentrated on what I thought should happen with Jewish education. One of the ideas, which is in the Calmes report, was that children after bar mitzvah seemed to be falling away, and I wanted to set up a part-time Jewish secondary school in 4 or 5 areas of London where it would be like a college post bar mitzvah.
Wow.
And that was one of the themes. But the theme of the Calmes report, of course, went deeply into the rabbinate, communities, and of course the finances. And as a result of the publication of the report, Sidney Frosh and his team resigned in the middle of their term of office. Wow. I had suggested that Stanley Calmes, now Lord Calmes, stood for president. He said, no, this is not for me. This is for you, Seymour. And so together with Tony Ansell and Leslie Wagner, who had been involved in the writing the Calmes report, I stood and won the election in '92 to be president, and they joined me as vice presidents.
Tony Ansell from Hendon?
Tony Ansell from Hendon, yeah. And Leslie Wagner moved out of London. He became the vice chancellor of Leeds Metropolitan University before he went on Aliyah.
Oh, wow. So Tony were neighbors. We were kind of neighbors in Hendon, a few doors.
Yes, he was a lawyer, but he liked to sit on the bench. He was more of a judge than a practicing solicitor.
Yeah, I was about to say, we called him judge. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, and what were the highlights? There must have been some, dare I say, funnier moments as well.
Funnier where?
Well, within the US.
There was nothing funny about becoming president of the United Synagogue with a £9 million deficit and a 1.5 million deficit on the pension fund. And the chief rabbi, the late Lord Sachs, he had just become chief rabbi and suddenly found himself with a new president. And we had to take some very drastic decisions to cut expenditure. And these were very difficult times. I can't really remember what you would call as funny. I enjoyed some of the events that we had at the United Synagogue. My first duty was to attend the Remembrance Day service in Hackney, which was happened every year in November. That was within a few weeks of me becoming president. And I had to have a top hat on because that was the tradition. The president came and they asked me what they should do. And I said, well, you do what you think is right. I was the new boy. I was the new president. And I was invited to make an impromptu speech, which of course I wasn't prepared for, but I seem to have survived. So they were good moments. And also throughout my period of time as president, we had to take some very harsh measures. So the first half, we were cutting back on subsidies to everything, cutting back on the office of the chief rabbi, the Beth Din. Wow. But we were then about to enter the celebrations of the 125th anniversary of the United Synagogue. And together with Lord Sachs, or Chief Rabbi Sachs, as he was then, we actually put on a fantastic year with a service, a big dinner at the Guildhall. He and I traveled all around the communities speaking. And that was a difficult moment because following Jonathan Sachs, after he has spoken is not an easy matter. So I used to try and speak first.
I was just about to say that.
So that whatever quotes I had used in my speeches, he was able to find others, whereas the other way around was much more difficult.
That's right.
Wow. So we had a great year celebrating the 125th anniversary. So they were the brighter moments. And more importantly than all, we started the first ever community development program for the United Synagogue, which is the forerunner of everything that you do now, that's going on in the local communities that simply didn't exist in 1995.
Amazing. It's amazing how things have developed. I just want to move on towards almost 2020, but two questions I'd like to ask, just with an eye on the clock as well. Number one, balancing all of that voluntary work and the United Synagogue and also within the shul with family. How does that work if you have to give advice to people? And number two,
give advice in what way?
Well, I think, thank God, people, Jews and others are good at volunteering, giving up their time, and balancing that with commitment to family. I do say this in a non-biased way. You've got a gorgeous family and a family that have very much followed in your footsteps. How does one balance the two? And then after that, a totally different question, which is the challenges that the community faces today. Okay.
I'm told that I balanced it by being away from home. My family tell me that I was never at home. I was at a meeting or not at a meeting. I was out doing something, communal work, right through from the London Ball days, the whole of the United Synagogue. And so when I look at my family now, active in shuls, and I say, surely you're not still doing shul work. They said, Dad, you don't remember that we went through. It's a very difficult balance. I was very fortunate that I was a senior director of the company I worked with. The chairman of the company was a very understanding guy, Jewish guy, and therefore he didn't mind me devoting some hours during the day to the work. So it wasn't only evenings. Some people, when they do these jobs, don't have time during the day to do them. So I was lucky, I was fortunate, and I enjoyed it. Your second part was about the community today, I think, yeah?
Yes.
You've got to decide whether we're answering that question before COVID or after COVID. Forgetting COVID, the community today is far better at the community level than it ever was back in my days at the United Synagogue, where everything was really a central control. And I think there has been a revival of Jewish education, not only with children, when I use the word Jewish education, right across the age group. The shuls are now communities. They're not just buildings of where we worship. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a major change. As I say, forgetting COVID, which has eaten into that, mm-hmm. Today, the communities are much more able to run their affairs, and programs are enormous, not only in Stanmore, but right across the community of all the synagogues. My complaint, if there is a complaint, is that my successors today at the United Synagogue still seem to think they want to run things centrally, and I think they should let go and allow more autonomy locally, which of course was one of the main planks of the Calms report, to devolve things down to the level of the people, mm-hmm. not to control it from some central building.
Right.
So I think that's really the community today. I think we still haven't faced up to the result of the COVID pandemic. I think we still aren't sure spiritually what it all means, and I think we're still looking for answers. We've survived without shul. How many people have continued in their homes with the festivals, with davening, is everyone's personal choice. So I think that is yet to be resolved.
Right. Yeah, I agree actually on that completely. I can see various different changes that may come about because of a post-COVID, era. Firstly, it's great to speak about a post-COVID era as well. Just the notion of it. But yeah, I can see real changes to definitely to the shul element of the community.
I think we might get freedom at Pesach, the way things are with the virus. We may have a new meaning to Pesach, redemption from all the slavery of the COVID crisis.
That's right. I'm waiting for the first vaccine that can insert the vaccine into the matzah. And then we don't have to go through an injection. We can just, have it in the matzah.
Are you patenting this idea? Or are you relying on all the bakers to put in that special ingredient? As long as they're still watching the clock, that the matzah is still Pesach there. That's very important. 8 o'clock.
The vaccine. Oh, fantastic. Seymour, it's been an absolute pleasure. We really appreciate the time. And we miss you. Please God, we look forward to, seeing each other in shul and even outside of shul. Thank you so much. And it's lovely to hear, the volunteer, the family element, the United Synagogue element. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you. That is always a pleasure.
Thanks, Seymour.
Okay, all the best.
Bye.